Have you ever stopped focusing in class but immediately began to refocus within a minute or two? Maybe you've been in math class and you hear a noise out in the hall, or your friend asks you for a pencil, and you get sidetracked and can't stop thinking about what distracted you. Your teacher notices that you are distracted and reminds you to pay attention, so you jump back into listening to the lesson. Well, for me, it takes between 10 to 30 minutes to regain focus. Once I get distracted, it is very hard to grab my attention again. Because of this inability to get back on track quickly compared to my classmates, I've always felt like I've had a different way of learning, but it was confirmed by my 4th grade teacher. Before 4th grade, I was known as the bad, misbehaved, over-talkative, can't sit still, not focused kid. I was often the kid who struggled with being able to follow the instructions, always moving around, and needed repetition of information in class. Teachers would often make quick assumptions and judgments of my behavior, and some were willing to give me some grace and patience. In 2nd grade, my teacher, let's call her Miss W, she had a tricolored board on the wall that represented each student's behavior for the day. It went from red if you were bad, to yellow if you were okay, to green if you were good. I didn't need to look at the board to know what my color was. It was red pretty much all of the time. I misbehaved so much that Miss W was inspired to create a mini behavior check-in slip that I would have to take home every day to show my parents if I was good or bad. One day I tripped over nothing and put my hands on the ground to catch myself. Miss W was very quick to turn her head and look over and start yelling at me. She stopped what she was doing, got up, and quickly walked over to her desk in disappointment. She was very annoyed and quickly grabbed one of my slips and checked the box saying I was misbehaving. She wrote a side note saying that I did a handstand in class. I tried telling her that I tripped, but she wouldn't even look at me, let alone listen to me. Similar events happened when I was in 3rd grade, with Miss O being my teacher. Don't get me wrong, she's a great teacher. I love her now, but she didn't have any patience with me. One day at school, my table group was talking. Everyone else had stopped talking for a second, but I continued to talk. One of the kids got up and told the teacher I wouldn't stop talking. Miss O didn't even wait a second before she rolled her eyes, and while making direct eye contact with me, she said exasperatingly, "Yeah, I know, she doesn't know how to stop." Those teachers made me feel left out, lonely, weird in a bad way, and stupid. Something teachers typically aren't supposed to do to students. Things really started to turn around for me when I was in Mr. B's 4th grade class. He noticed my challenging behaviors within the first few days of school. Instead of labeling me as the bad kid or assuming that this is just how I was, he saw that there was something off and maybe there was a reason behind these behaviors. He used to work with kids who have neurological disorders, so he started working with me with these different teaching techniques. After working with me for a little bit, he came to the conclusion that I might have ADHD. He risked losing his job and informed my parents and recommended getting me tested. My parents agreed and was assessed to see if in fact I did have ADHD. And turns out I do have ADHD. For the rest of elementary school, I was pulled out of the class 2 to 3 times a week and went to a resource class where we would work on homework, do activities, and make sure that I was keeping up with the material in class. Even with my diagnosis and being in the resource program, I still had to deal with a lot of teachers who didn't understand my needs and help me appropriately. In 7th grade, fresh out of elementary school, I struggled keeping up in school and I needed a lot of help. 3 years after I was diagnosed, the teachers that were supposed to help me treated me as if I was some dumb middle school kid. My core support teachers helped me, but there was a price to their help. While working on homework with them, if I didn't understand a question or genuinely didn't know the answer, they got annoyed with me. They assumed I didn't want to do the work or that I was just trying to have them tell me the answers. I have a hard time doing schoolwork on my own because I don't always understand, so it's easier to wait and get help. When I got to class and told them I didn't do the work because I needed help, they looked at me as if I was a failure and they were very disappointed in me. I would work on math with my teacher and she would get very frustrated if I didn't understand a question or how to solve an equation. If I made a mistake on a basic equation, she would laugh in my face, making me feel like I was the problem and that I was stupid and didn't know anything. I worked with a paraeducator most of the time, unless I needed to work on math. Unfortunately, the paraeducator was kind of the same way. When we would work on English or history, and I answered an obvious question wrong, she would kind of laugh in my face like she couldn't believe my answer. One night at a parent-teacher conference, after my mom and teacher had a little bit of casual back-and-forth talk, they started to talk about school. My teacher told my mom that I didn't do anything in class and I'm such a failure. I began to talk back and inform my mom that wasn't true, but I was cut off by my teacher laughing in my face once again. She raised her voice a little bit, and with a confused tone in her voice, she asked if I was calling her a liar. And I said, "I ain't calling you a truther." I didn't actually say that. If you know, you know. Even though those teachers' jobs was to support and help people who have different learning abilities, they didn't understand how I learned. I started 8th grade with the same teachers, and thankfully it started off better than last year, but there was still some tension. Throughout the year, I never worked with the teacher, I always worked with the paraeducator. While everyone was working on assignments, the teacher sat at her desk with her headphones in on her computer, or she would leave class and go to the teacher room. At the parent-teacher conference that year, my teacher continued to tell my mom that I didn't do any work in class. She never paid attention or was even in class to know if I was working or not, so it's interesting that she was able to make such claims. Towards the end of the year, my teacher set up a meeting with my mom and a coursework teacher from high school that she really wanted me to have. I was pulled out of 5th period to go to my coursework class to meet with my new teacher. I met with Miss Song and she asked me questions about how I'm doing in school and asked me what subject was my lowest grade. Before I can even answer, my teacher cut me off and said something along the lines of, "Oh, yeah, let me pull up her grade. She isn't doing very good." I ignored my teacher's rude comment and whispered my answer to Miss Song. My teacher continued to tell my mom and Miss Song that she thought that I didn't do anything and that I wasn't a good student. When she cut me off, I was scared to talk and respond to any questions, so I just decided to sit there and stay quiet. After listening to my teacher talk bad about me for a few more minutes, she deemed that it wasn't necessary for me to be there anymore, so she sent me back to class. In recalling the meeting later, both my mom and Miss Song told me that the teacher had continued to criticize me and talk over them when they tried to talk and support me. That course support teacher, unfortunately, was another example of a teacher that was supposed to help me but didn't. The only way she really helped me was by putting me into Mrs. Song's class. In high school, I moved into Mrs. Song's resource class, and it was so much better. However, when I got to 10th grade, which was over Zoom, I felt like my ADHD was only getting worse under the circumstances of being at home with many distractions. I talked to my mom and doctor, and we made the decision for me to start taking Adderall to see if that could help. I started off with 10 milligrams, but when that proved to not be enough, my dosage was increased by increments of 5. We only had a little bit of flexibility because of my limit, which was 30 milligrams. Thankfully, we settled at 25 milligrams, which was the sweet spot of the medication helping me, and that's what I've been taking for the past year. Adderall affects ADHD by reducing impulsivity and improving a person's attention and focus. Adderall helps with ADHD by enhancing the amount of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, which increases the activity in the central nervous system. While the medication helps tolerate and live with ADHD, medication does not fix it. There is no cure for it, so this is something that I will always have to deal with and constantly work with for the rest of my life. Most people believe that people with ADHD are always hyper, but that's not true. There is actually several different kinds of ADHD and can manifest differently in people. People with ADHD can be super calm and you can't even tell that they have it, but that's seen mostly in women. People with ADHD are known to struggle with sitting still, and that's because people with ADHD show reduced cortical thickness in the front parts of their brain, which is responsible for motor control and response inhibition. A lot of people with ADHD also tend to have other neurological disorders that work in combination with ADHD, like ODD, OCD, depression, anxiety, short-term memory, and bipolar disorder. I heard someone explain ADHD combined with anxiety as if you're playing rock, paper, scissors. Rock and paper are thrown against each other. The rock represents the H in ADHD, which is hyperactivity, and the paper represents anxiety. Paper always wins. So when people have this kind of ADHD and anxiety, they don't necessarily display their hyper characteristics, and the anxiety will take over and kind of hide the hyperactivity. People with ADHD have episodes. These episodes can be triggered by stress, poor sleep, overstimulation, etc. These ADHD episodes cause impulsive behavior, hyperactivities, or difficulty sustaining attention, and sometimes it's a combination of all. Not a lot of people understand what ADHD is and have convinced themselves that they do in fact understand and that they know what they should say to someone who has ADHD. Let's talk about some things that you should never say to a person with ADHD. I've had people tell me not to use my ADHD as an excuse. When you tell a person with ADHD, especially a child, that they are using their neurological disorder as an excuse, it will cause them to believe that their learning and processing style doesn't matter, and that they should just push through any obstacle instead of trying to understand themselves and finding what works for them. I tell people that I have ADHD not for their pity or to use it as an excuse to get out of something, but so that they understand why I work differently. Teachers or other people who say ADHD is only an excuse are also showing that they don't believe that it is real. When working with someone who has ADHD, do not tell them to just focus or just sit still, because we can't just do what you want us to do. It takes some time and patience to get us to focus. We can't just jump back in like most people. We have trouble sitting still because sitting still is understimulating. Sometimes in order to focus, we need to fidget. I've had teachers say, if you can focus on fun things, you can focus on your work. We don't struggle focusing in general, we struggle focusing on the right thing. People with ADHD can spend hours playing video games, tinkering around the house, or writing a whole book, but it is harder when there is a specific thing that we need to do and focus on. It can be very difficult to remain in control of what we are focusing on. What people who don't have ADHD may not understand or ever experience is the frustration that comes with it. It is not a choice to be off task or zone out, and people who have ADHD shouldn't be treated like they are making these conscious decisions. People and teachers around the world need to try and understand ADHD more. All professionals should get training on what ADHD is and how to work efficiently with people who have ADHD. People need to understand what ADHD is and not belittle people just because they learn differently. It is unfair to people who have ADHD that don't understand what it is to have people treat them like something is wrong with them, like they are weird, stupid, and just bad kids.